Every engineer who walked the back acreage along Township Road 212 in Coshocton County, Ohio, looked at the same 18 acres and saw the same thing. Dry ground, good drainage, ordinary dirt that had held cattle and corn for 60 years and could surely hold a track hoe for a few more months. 11 different men signed off on that opinion between March and September of 2021. Geologists and engineers among them, one with 31 years at the company and a pension already waiting for him at the end of it. They were all looking at the same patch of ground. They were all wrong. It took that ground 4 months to prove it. By then, a 23-year-old named Adeline Calder had already told Castle Rock Pipeline Company, in writing, twice, exactly where it would happen, and roughly how deep the hole would go. Nobody at Castle Rock kept her letters. She kept copies of her own. This is the story of how an orphaned farm girl ended up knowing something 11 company men didn't, and what it cost the ones who decided her age mattered more than her father's handwriting. This is the kind of story my father would have told slow, at his own kitchen table, with all the names left in. If yours did too, this channel is built for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. The trouble started on the second Tuesday of April 2021, inside the Linton Township Volunteer Fire Hall, 11 miles outside Coshocton, Ohio. Castle Rock Pipeline Company had rented the hall for the evening to walk landowners through a 30-inch natural gas transmission line that would eventually cross 9,000 acres of farmland spread across 3 counties. Folding chairs lined up 8 to a row. A coffee urn somebody's wife had brought from home, set up on a card table by the door. The smell of wet wool and diesel off the trucks parked outside. Because it had rained sideways since noon, and the gravel lot had gone soft enough to pull a boot clean off a man's foot if he wasn't careful where he stepped. Most of the room was farmers in their 50s and 60s, men who'd signed easement papers before and knew the language well enough to ask sharp questions about depth of cover and restoration timelines. A few wore Case 8 caps gone soft and pale at the brim. Lyle Boehner, a corn and soybean man with 40 years on the same 80 acres 2 miles north, asked the only other question of the night that didn't come from a company man, something about whether the tile lines would be repaired before or after planting season. A county road map was pinned to a corkboard near the front, the proposed corridor marked in red marker that had bled slightly into the paper. Rain kept up a steady drum against the hall's tin roof through most of the meeting, loud enough that the Castle Rock representative running the slideshow had to raise his voice twice to be heard over it. There was one young woman in the room. She sat in the back row in a barn coat 2 sizes too big, a coat that had belonged to somebody else before it belonged to her, with a manila folder on her lap instead of a phone. Her name was Adeline Calder, and most people in that room still knew her only as Walter Calder's girl, which by April of 2021 wasn't entirely true anymore. Walter had been gone 17 months. She farmed 142 acres on Township Road 219, a half-mile from where Castle Rock planned to put a valve station and pump building on land the company had bought from a neighbor named Harlan Eicher the previous fall. She wasn't on the agenda. She wasn't selling anybody an easement. When she raised her hand during the question period and asked whether anyone had pulled the old mine maps for that stretch of ground, a man near the front let out a short laugh before he caught himself. Not cruel, exactly. Just the sound of a grown man finding a question unusual, coming from somebody who looked, to him, like she ought to be asking about something else. Behind her, somebody leaned toward his neighbor and said, just loud enough, didn't realize Walter's girl took up geology, and the neighbor chuckled, low, not really meaning anything by it either. Adeline didn't turn around. She wasn't loud about it, and she wasn't apologetic about it. She just waited for an answer. The Castle Rock project manager, a man named Gerald Hollis, thanked her for the comment and told the room the geotechnical survey had already cleared the site. "Ground's fine here," he said. "Always has been." He wasn't being dismissive, not exactly. Or maybe he was, just gently, the way confident men sometimes are without quite meaning to be. He had a report in a binder and 19 years of pipeline projects where reports like that had gone about the way they were supposed to. Not arrogant. Not careless, either, just a man with no particular reason, that night, to believe this one would be different. She left the fire hall a little after 9, drove home with the wipers going, and sat at the kitchen table a long while before she went up to bed. She didn't decide that night to do anything in particular. She just couldn't stop thinking about the southeast corner of the Eicher place, and the way her father used to slow the truck down whenever they passed it, never saying much, just slowing down. The way a person does near a grave they don't visit often, but haven't forgotten either. The ground in question was 18 acres along Township Road 212, part of the 9,000-acre corridor Castle Rock had spent 14 months assembling through purchase and easement across Coshocton, Tuscarawas, and Guernsey counties. The company had paid Harlan Eicher $182,000 for the surface rights and the right to put a permanent valve station on the southeast corner of his property. The same corner where, Adeline knew from her father's notebook, the original Calder family land had once run before her grandfather sold off a piece of it, back in 1971. The geotechnical report Hollis carried that night said the soil-bearing capacity was more than adequate for a station foundation and for the heavy equipment needed to build it. Nobody who wrote that report had asked what was underneath the soil. Coal had come out of that ground once, decades before any man in that fire hall was born, and the people who pulled it out hadn't always written down exactly where they'd stopped digging. Castle Rock's corridor across the 3 counties ran something close to $240 million once right-of-way, materials, and labor were figured together, a number Hollis had quoted from memory more than once at meetings just like this one. Against a budget that size, the 18 acres along Township Road 212 looked like nothing worth slowing down for. A rounding error in a much larger set of numbers. Adeline's grandfather had sold off that same corner of ground in 1971 for $3,800. Back when the coal company that worked it had already been gone for over a decade, and nobody in the family particularly wanted to farm ground that occasionally settled an inch or two without explanation. 60 years later, the same handful of acres was about to cost a different company a good deal more than that. She didn't argue at the meeting. She went home, took her father's notebook down off the shelf above the gun cabinet, and the next morning she walked the fence line along Township Road 212 with a 100-foot tape and a pocket compass. She measured the slope of the bank. She measured the width of the swale running parallel to the road. She measured the distance from an old fence post to a culvert that hadn't moved by her father's own notes in over 40 years. Earl Tackett, who farmed the place directly across the road and had retired from deep mining himself back in 1988, watched her do it for the better part of 2 mornings before he finally walked over and asked what exactly she was looking for. "Ground's hollow under that corner," she told him. "Has been, probably, since the 40s. She showed him a page from the notebook. He didn't say much. He just nodded, slow, the particular nod of a man whose right knee always ached worse before rain and who just had something he'd half suspected for years quietly confirmed by somebody he trusted. Earl had worked the hollow rock seam himself, 3 miles south of where they stood, and he knew better than most how far those old room and pillar workings could run under a man's property without anybody on the surface ever bothering to ask. She found a rusted length of pipe sticking up out of the grass near the fence corner, no more than 2 inches across, capped at the top. The kind of thing a person could walk past 100 times without noticing. Her father's notebook had a sketch of the same spot, dated 1996, marked Old Vent, Mine Ventilation, Do Not Disturb. She also pulled a set of aerial photographs from the county auditor's office going back to 1958 and laid them side by side on the kitchen table, and there it was if a person knew to look for it. A faint depression running diagonal across the corner of the Eicher property in nearly every photograph since. Never quite enough to show up on a soil survey. Never quite enough for anybody driving past at 45 miles an hour to notice either. Walter Calder had spent 19 years as a mine surveyor for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Division of Mineral Resources Management, walking abandoned coal workings across 6 counties and marking where the old timbers had rotted, where the pillars had started to crush under their own weight, where water had moved in, and where the ground above had already begun settling without anybody noticing it from a tractor seat. He kept a notebook separate from his official state files, a habit that started, he told Adeline once, because the state's records were only as good as what the old mining companies had bothered to leave behind, and plenty of them hadn't bothered much at all. He started bringing her along when she was 9 years old, mostly because her mother had died that spring, and there was nobody else to watch her on the days he worked. The first couple of years she mostly just carried the rod and complained about ticks. By the time she was 12, she could read a contour line faster than some of the men he worked alongside, men twice her age with surveying degrees. He taught her to spot a sink before it opened, the particular sag in a fence line or a stand of timber that meant the ground underneath was already giving way, slow, the way a mattress gives long before anybody notices the springs are gone. He taught her, mostly, to write everything down, even the things that seemed too small to matter at the time. Because a person never knew which small thing would turn out to matter most in 20 years. One entry from the spring she was 14 read, in his shorthand, crosscut runs SE under fence corner. Water sound audible after rain. Owner not told. Nobody asked. He never explained that last line to her directly. She came to understand it on her own, the way she understood most of what he meant, instead of what he actually said. Landowners weren't always told what sat underneath their own ground, not because anybody meant harm by it, but because nobody had ever made it anybody's particular job to tell them. And a state surveyor covering 6 counties with a teenage daughter riding along in the truck couldn't knock on every door himself. He died in November of 2019, walking a fence line on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his heart simply stopping the way some men's do, with no warning anybody could point to afterward, not even Earl, who'd seen him out walking not 2 hours before. He left her the farm, the cattle, $4,200 in a savings account, and the notebook. She is 23 now, and she still keeps it on the same shelf he did. For a long time she didn't know whether she'd ever need it for anything beyond her own ground. That spring she found out she did. The old workings under that stretch of Coshocton County belonged to what her father's notebook called the Hollow Rock Mine No. 4. Worked from 1931 until it closed in 1958. Room and pillar style, roughly 80 feet down. Room and pillar mining leaves square columns of coal standing to hold the roof up while the rest of the seam gets dug out around them. Over 60 years, those pillars can crush. The rock above can sag, slow, sometimes for decades before anybody on the surface notices a thing. Water gets into the old works and softens whatever support is left. Add the weight of a loaded excavator or a welding rig parked in the same spot for hours at a stretch, and ground that looks solid from the seat of a truck can give way without much warning at all. Her father's map showed a crosscut running almost directly beneath the corner of the Eicher property, where Castle Rock planned to set the valve station's foundation piers. Give or take a few feet, depending on how carefully a man read the old survey notation. The geotechnical firm Castle Rock hired had drilled borings and run their numbers the modern way, But nobody had cross-checked those borings against a set of 1930s mine survey notation that had never been digitized and existed, as far as anybody could tell, in exactly two places: a state archive in Columbus that hadn't been touched in years, and a notebook on a shelf above a gun cabinet on Township Road 219. She wrote Hollis a letter that May, certified mail, with a copy of the relevant map page enclosed. He wrote back in June, polite, thanking her for her concern, noting that the geotechnical firm stood by its findings. She wrote again in July. No reply that time. Construction started the first week of August. The crew worked a normal pace through the first 10 days, grading, setting forms, nobody thinking much about an unsent third letter sitting in a farmhouse drawer a half-mile away. On the 11th day, a Caterpillar excavator working the foundation cut for the valve station dropped its right track into ground that simply wasn't there anymore. Not far. Maybe 4 feet. Far enough that the operator killed the engine and got out fast, and far enough that the hole kept widening for another 20 minutes after he did. Slow, almost patient about it, until it had opened to nearly 9 feet across, with a sound the crew foreman later described, more than once, as a kind of low groan he felt in his boots before he heard it. Nobody moved for a second. Nobody said much. Nobody on that crew wanted to be the one to call it in. Nobody was hurt. The crew pulled back behind the orange tape, and Hollis drove out himself within the hour. What the soil engineers found once they got a probe down into it was exactly what an old room and pillar crosscut looks like from above after 60 years of water and time get finished with it. Word reached the county engineer's office by the next morning, and a state mine safety inspector was out at the site within 2 days, walking the perimeter with a clipboard of his own, asking Hollis the same question Adeline had asked back in April, except now nobody in the room found it the slightest bit unusual. He called Adeline Calder that same evening and asked if he could come by the farm with a notebook in mind. She told him to bring the actual geotechnical report this time. He did. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table her father used to spread his own maps across, and Hollis held the map page up at an angle to catch the kitchen light better, the way a man checks a bill for a watermark, and looked at lines that matched, almost foot for foot, what his own engineers were now telling him about the hole on the Eicher property. He didn't argue. He sat with it a minute, quiet. "I had the boring logs," he said finally. "I just never thought to ask anybody what was under the boring logs." Then he asked her, plain, why nobody at the company had taken her seriously back in April. She told him she didn't know. She said it twice, like she was still turning the question over for herself, and didn't entirely believe either answer she might have given him. 11 days of idle crew and equipment, at a little over $164,000 a day in lost labor and standby rental costs, came out close to a $1. $8 million before the line ever moved another foot of dirt. The reroute, shifting the valve station 600 feet northeast onto ground her father's maps showed clean, added another $640, 000 on top of that. Hollis signed off on both numbers without much discussion. He'd already done that math himself, the hard way, standing at the edge of a 9-foot hole in a field 11 different men had told him was solid. Castle Rock paid Adeline Calder $45,000 for the use of her father's records and put her under a standing consulting agreement for the remainder of the corridor through Coshocton County. $1,200 a week for as long as the project kept moving through ground he'd ever mapped. Word travels the way it does in a county that size. By the following spring, 3 other landowners along the route had called her directly, asking her to walk their fence lines before anybody from any pipeline company set foot on them again. Harlan Eicher, who'd sold the surface rights in the first place and felt some embarrassment about the whole thing afterward, started telling people he'd known the Calders were careful people, the kind who didn't say much until they had something worth saying. The county engineer's office, not long after, began asking applicants for any large excavation permit whether they'd checked their parcel against the old mine maps at all. A small new line on a form that hadn't existed the year before. She is 24 this spring. She still runs the cattle. She still keeps the books. She still writes everything down, the way her father did. 22 head of Angus on the home farm, which at roughly $1,450 a head on a normal fall market comes out to a herd worth a little under $32,000, plus whatever the consulting work brings in on top of that most months. She still drives the same Ford F-250 her father bought used back in 2011 and keeps her hay equipment running mostly on faith and a John Deere baler that's older than she is. She still keeps the notebook on the shelf above the gun cabinet, though she's added 2 notebooks of her own beside it now. She doesn't think of herself as any kind of expert. Not really. She just knows what her father taught her to look for. And she's careful. And she writes things down. The way he did, the way his own father apparently did before him. Though that notebook never made it down through the family, and nobody alive can say for certain what was in it. Earl Tackett still tells the story to anybody who'll listen, standing at the same fence line where he first watched a young woman pace off ground with a tape and a compass and a notebook that wasn't even hers to begin with. Not really, except that it was. He says the company wasn't foolish, exactly. Just confident in the wrong direction for a while, the way most people are when nobody's ever had reason to tell them otherwise. He says the ground doesn't care how many engineers sign their names to a report, and it doesn't care how old a person is, either, or whether she's got a degree to back up what she knows. It only cares what's true. Some things a man can learn from a binder. Some things he can only learn from somebody who walked the land before him, wrote it down, and left it where his daughter could find it.